Welcome to the What is God podcast. I'm Sheefra Bloom, your hostess. And in this podcast, I talk to people from all walks of life and ask them the question, what and where is God? And what does it have to do with me? And in this podcast episode, this is a very special episode where I'm actually talking to my little sister and best friend, Jenna Blumenthal. And this was actually a Zoom conversation that she and I had one day after she had been to Israel. And we were just talking on the phone and talking about God, and some philosophical conversation was happening. And she asked me, basically, how do I explain God to someone? And how do I explain my belief in God to someone who might not also feel the same way as me, besides just saying that I believe in it? Like, how do I explain it? And I got so excited because I love talking about this. And I said, oh, let's talk about this. I know. And I said, but wait, I want to talk about this with you, but can we hop on Zoom so that I can record the conversation? And so she was amenable to that. We hopped on Zoom and we were able to record the conversation. And so that is what you are hearing now, is actually my answer to the question of what is God. And I hope that you enjoy it. I talk about this a lot. I have a lot that I like to say on the matter. So this is one answer, or one conversation's worth of answers. And I hope you enjoy.
So, hi, Jenna.
Hi, Sheefra.
Oh, I'm so excited. I got so excited because we were talking about God. And what was your question exactly?
How do we believe in God other than saying it's just a feeling? How do we not prove it to someone, but convey our belief in God?
Yeah, I think it was something like, how do we express and articulate our belief in God, and like kind of like argue the existence of God? Like, how do you argue the existence of God? And so
Mhm.
I got really excited because you said something like that you didn't know how to. And I was like, I know how to. I wrote a book on it. Let's go.
Let's
Okay.
go.
Okay, so let's go. So then I was like, I'm going to tell you, but let's record it. And it shouldn't take too long. On the one hand, we could talk for lifetimes about it. On the other hand, we can probably do this in 5 minutes. So the thing that I got so excited about is like, oh, well, I can talk about the existence of God and I can articulate it in a really compelling way. And the reason I can do that is because I start with a redefinition of what is God. And that's what I've been talking about this whole time since I was 19 years old. And I wrote the essay for the JLI that got me to Princeton. It was called What and Where is God? And what does it have to do with me? And so in order to have this conversation about God, we have to actually define the term. What are we talking about? So that's the first thing I would say,
Mhm.
right? So, a lot of people think of God as this like male deity that's sitting on a cloud with lightning bolts. I think that was Zeus. I'm not really up on ancient mythologies, but it's not what I mean when I say God, right? And in in this tradition, we don't have a face. There's not a face of God in terms of like a deity, or I mean idolatry. There's no kind of like thing like that. In fact, that's the opposite of what this tradition does. The only countenance for God that we see is creation itself, or your face and my face, where we are the faces of God. We're all the faces of God. The countenance of God is in creation itself, and that's in the teaching. So
Mhm.
that's just one thing to mention, kind of as a prerequisite to this conversation, is that we're not talking about a God that's like this deity up on the clouds, or that's this idol that you can set on your altar. That's explicitly not what we're talking about. And the existence of a God like that is explicitly not what this tradition believes in, right? So we have to redefine what is often a misunderstanding of God. And then we go into God in the Hebrew and we find out, oh my God, there's so many words for the word God. There's so many different ways to say God. I think Anabacoach has like the letters, it's like this code, and it has 72 different names for God in it. And they all kind of mean slightly different things because they're all kind of pointing to slightly different attributes for God. There's the personal God, and then there's the God in the elements, and then there's the God. It's like, oh wow, there's the God that's, the sovereignty. There's all kinds of names. It's all the same God. So when I talk about God, I go to the four-letter word for God, the Yod He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton. That's like if I were to pick one of the words, that's like the word for God. That's like God, the Yod He Vav He. So I say this all the time. I say in the Hebrew, the word for God doesn't really translate like God. It's like a stand-in. It's like, but what does that mean? And so it's a four-letter narrative. It's not a word. It's a narrative. And it's not even a four-lettered narrative. It's a four-symboled narrative. The Hebrew letters are symbols themselves. It's a four-symboled narrative that tells the story of creation. And that we translate as God. So it's like this. So it's like, wow, now God has become a verb in a way. It's like life in action, creation in action in each moment. And that narrative, it's a whole narrative for how the infinite becomes finite. And that's what we call God.
Mm-hmm.
And I could go into that narrative, but since we wanted to keep this in like under 5 minutes, and then we could keep talking about it more if we want. But the short answer is that word, I translate it to mean the infinite life force that animates all of creation. Because if you were to summarize the narrative that the Yod He Vav He stand for, maybe I'll go into like a recap of that narrative really quick. But if you were to summarize the narrative, it's animating creation, making creation a thing in each moment anew, in each instant. And that's God. It's the animating life force. And then the other thing that's cool about that word is that word, the Yud He Vav He, in the Jewish tradition, it's very taboo to try and pronounce that word. And in other traditions, you have, different traditions that try to say the Yud He Vav He, right? Like you have Jehovah's Witness, you have, different people try and pronounce it, but they fall short. Jehovah's not, it's like I'm saying it because it's not how you say it. It's an attempt, it's fine, it's whatever, but it's not how you say it. And in fact, though, I always say this is not taboo to say it. It's not that it's taboo, it's that it's not possible. Same with like, it's not that there's no other gods and I'm the only God. It's just that there's nothing else really, at the end of the day, right? So it's like it's not that it's taboo to say that word, it's that it's not possible. And it's not possible because there's no vowels in it. And if you were to try and say that word, it would sound like breathing. It would just sound like breath. What is breath but the animate life force, with the infinite life force that animates all of creation, right? And so it goes back to your definition of, well, what is God? And that there is a force that we cannot articulate and box that is greater beyond us, that even science can't fully understand it. And even like in the metaphysics, they're coming up with new theories and new theories and new theories, and our understanding of it is still so very limited, and the best scientists know that. So that there is some force that animates life that is beyond our ability to fully articulate it. To me, that seems self-evident, and that's what we call God. So to say there's not a God, to say that there's not God, which isn't a God, it's the force that is the tetragrammaton that is creation happening. That is to say that there's not that, would be to say that there's not God, would be to say that creation's not happening, would be to say that there's not life.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll give you a quick recap just because we're doing this in a little video. Yod He Vav He, the spark, the first pre-thought, the seed. And that's when, if I were to kind of narrative it and anthropomorphize the infinite life force in God, which it's like we anthropomorphize God. It's not, we're microcosms of God, so we're mirrors of that energy. So it's natural to anthropomorphize it, but it's not a human right? But it is because it's us, but we're just faces of it. We're like clues into it. We're little parts of it. Um,
Mhm.
but the narrative would go, okay, before there was anything, there was everything and nothing. There was the Ein Sof, there was the without end. That's what it's called. It's called the without end. And the without end thought, oh God, oh golly, I'd really like to be in a relationship. I think I'll create a creation. And so it creates so in order to get bigger essentially and diversify itself and have itself become many, have the one become many, it has to first make itself smaller. So it contracts itself through the process of Simsum to make itself smaller before it can become bigger. Okay, as you listen to this story, we notice how this is true for the creation in our own lives, right? So it makes itself smaller to become bigger. Then it creates a void, it creates a space, and in that space is nothing. So how many times between creative moments in our lives do we feel like we actually have to contract and go into the nothingness, and there's no creativity, and sometimes it feels hopeless, and you're just in the void, and that's called tohu. And so the Ein Sof goes into the void, into the tohu. But in the tohu, in the void, there's nothing. So it can't even create a creation. Now there's space for it, but there's no energy for it. So now the infinite has to put in enough energy, and it does this through a ray of light that we call a kav. It puts in enough energy into the void to animate creation, but not so much so as to obliterate it, right? So if it's just so, same with you, oh, now I have an idea, I'm going to put in enough energy to fuel this project, but not so much that I just like burn out, right? So
Mhm.
that's what the infinite does. And then it has this kav, and then and then the kav has energy, and then it animates creation, and the God, that energy, the divine hides itself through the veil of creation, which is why if you ever get mystical moments of just like moments of like, I feel something when I look up at the stars. I just feel something when I look into your eyes. I feel something when I sit in those moments of meditation from the app that I'm using or whatever it is. I feel something when I get into the cold river that just, I can't put my name on it. If we could define and articulate God, that would almost be the opposite of the definition of God. Like the definition of God is inherently that it's beyond.
Mhm.
And yet it's also inherently a paradox because it's the simplest of the simple. It is life happening. So anyway, so that's the yud hey, the vav, and then the hey is the life happening. So the yud's like pre-thought, like maybe I'll create creation, but like even before that. And then the hey is like this expansiveness of now there's a void. And then the vav, which is a line. If you look up these letters, because I'm not showing them, the yod's a dot. The
Yeah.
hey is, I know you know, but the hey is like
Mhm.
wider like this. It's the space. The vav is a straight line. It's the kav. It's that energy going into the void. And then the next hey is bigger again. It's the life breath, the lungs, the legs, the action of creation itself. And that, my love, is God. and
Mhm.
and so it's in each and every one of us. And to say that there's no God or to diminish God to a single deity, both of those would be, in my opinion, incorrect.
Mhm.
And then the more we learn about this, because this is the blueprint, we are made in God's image. The more we learn about this cosmic energy, the more we learn how to navigate our own energy and how to move through our own creations in our own way. So that's my answer, my brief answer, and that's what I get really excited about talking about. And that's what I'm going to talk about in my group and excuse me, in my group and in the mystery school. And I'm really excited about it.
Well, thanks, Sheefra. I enjoyed learning about it.
Maybe I should start a podcast called What and Where is God? A Mystical Perspective.
That's like your book, right?
My book is called Four Worlds Transmission One.
Or your speech. Your speech.
Yeah, my speech was called What and Where is God and What Does It Have to Do with Me? That'd be cool.
It would be good. I think people would like that.
All right. Well,
I like it. No, that was interesting. I don't think I've heard the whole thing before.
oh, that was not the whole thing.
No, 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 but like I don't know if you walked me through the letters before.
Oh, good. I'm getting good at saying it pretty quickly. I hope that
Yeah.
that landed. Obviously, there's a lot more detail and nuance that we can get into, but I just was giving the gist of it.
If you have your speech, I'd read it.
I'd say that more, probably better than my speech that I wrote when I was 20 years old would be the book that I channeled last year.
There you go. I'll read that.
Yeah, and I finished with my editor. We finished out the job. It's complete with my editor today. However, I'm actually going to send it. I don't know if you know a professional proofreader. I'm going to send it to a professional proofreader to just go through it one more time before my editor sends me back like a final, like saleable electronic version of the book, which is so exciting. And
Exciting. That's awesome.
thanks for coming on here and letting me talk about this because it just reminds me how passionate I am about talking about this and how, like, it reminds me of how much I do have to share.
Thank you for answering my questions so that I can defend myself to people.
And my hope for you is that you can, like, that was just like a quick transmission.
Yeah.
But my hope, and especially like, when I have the group program and the mystery school and stuff, my hope is that I can see the chips. That's so cute.
It's late, but I'm gonna start cooking.
You disappeared. Anyway, no, it's all good. You should cook. I see your eggs.
Yeah.
So cute. Um, yeah, but the whole thing is that as we go deeper into the four worlds and into the Sphirot and energy centers in the four worlds, that you would cultivate your own relationship to that which is God, which we call God, so
Mhm.
that you wouldn't need my way of articulating it, and that you would develop your own relationship to that narrative, and that you'll have your own way of explaining it. And part of what comes through when I talk about it is just my confidence and my knowing in what
Yeah.
I'm talking about.
Well, I have a follow-up question because I feel like a common argument people use is like people who believe in God often argue everything happens for a reason. It's like, and if you read the Torah, then it's like I don't remember the whole story, but it's like Joseph did all these things and you think it's all going wrong, but then ultimately it all was for the good, but we can't see that because we're just people. And so then people will be like, well, they'll like list off things in the news, like, oh, well, all these kids died of famine and this bus crashed and this guy got bombed. And you think there's a reason for that? And like people will say that, and I don't know how to respond to that either. So
I have an answer.
okay, I'd love to hear it.
It's not all for good.
Yeah.
And it's not all for bad either. What it
So
is,
yeah.
what it is it's all for, in some ways, ultimately you could say, like maybe in the really bigger picture, it's all for good,
Yeah.
but like your higher self and even like this life energy that is God,
Mhm.
like if you win the thing or lose the thing, it's kind of like not that important in the scheme of things. And
No, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and and like even, God forbid, like when tragedy happens,
Mhm.
there's an underlying opportunity to learn something. And
Yeah.
that's true. And it doesn't necessarily make it less painful, less hard, or less tragic. But
Yeah.
the people who are arguing that, oh, well, ultimately it's all for good, they're assuming that God wants us to just be like peaceful and chill.
Not the
And
people
like,
stop. Like,
and that's
yeah,
actually not the point. Like, from as far as I can tell, from like the higher soul's perspective, like God's so beyond, it's like it's hard to even say like God, like the life force wants life to happen and it wants
hmm,
life to interact. And that's the important thing. So let's just say from the perspective of like the higher soul doesn't really care if you get the job or if you don't, or like the higher soul is going to give you what you need to learn the lessons that you need to learn so that you can grow and so that you can evolve. And
yeah.
and so and so um the angle of that question is kind of off. Like the point is kind of off. And
Well,
so
because yeah, go ahead.
the prayer shouldn't necessarily be, to God to help it be, easier or help the tragedies not happen. The prayer should probably be help us as humanity come to
Yeah.
a deeper understanding, a deeper place of loving kindness and forgiveness, and really a deeper embodiment of the 11 Sefirot, which is what Kabbalah teaches, right? So that, you know, we have more harmonious way of living together, right? And even like tragedies that are natural disasters, like Hurricane Katrina, well, it was such a disaster because of the human infrastructure that was in place that was out of alignment with nature. So the more that we're in alignment with God, with the flow of life happening, the
Yeah.
like less these tragedies are going to happen. And the more we are embodied in those energy centers in the Sefirot, which are the Kabbalistic tree of life, then the more in harmony the experience will be. And the more out of balance, collectively, not just individually. It's both though, right?
Well,
So
yeah. I think the examples you're saying make a lot of sense, and I think those are easier to explain. But let's say like someone's child dies, like that's much harder to explain, you know? You don't think
it's
so?
it's never less tragic. It's completely and utterly tragic. And it doesn't make God any less real. God wasn't trying to give them a blissful experience.
So if
That
someone's
was,
like, you know, did it happen for a reason? Like, was it part of God's plan? Like, you know what I mean?
but here's the thing. It all happens for a reason in that there's always a next step that can happen, but it's choice. We don't always have activated the element of choice. If we're in flight or fight or reactivity mode, then we don't actually have really the element of choice. We're in reactivity. The animal body, the animal soul, the animal is driving. If we want the higher soul to drive, when we activate the higher soul, which is again part of the process of going through these teachings, and that's what the story alchemy does, it gets you out of fight or flight and it gets you into parasympathetic so you can access your, you know, I'm pointing here because there's a whole other teaching about the pituitary gland, but essentially you can access these states of being more centered and being more grounded and being able to see clearer. Then you have choice. And so part of it is to be able to activate the attribute of choice, of will. And we have different kinds of intuition, we have different kinds of will. So first you have to get out of fight or flight. That's what the four world story alchemy does. And you've done, I think, a little bit of story work with me. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the story alchemy does. That's where, we dispel these essentially spells, these stories that we take for granted as true that aren't true. We get out of that fight or flight that maybe we didn't even know we were in. Suddenly we can see now we've activated the element of choice. Many people out there don't even have that attribute of choice. Once we have choice, now you have choice in every moment. So it's not that it's predestined necessarily. That's a whole deeper conversation as well. But if you activate the attribute of choice, you now get to respond. And so, anyway, that's like you have you have the option of how you want to respond. So it didn't happen for a reason because it was all planned. It's all part of your choices. Like this is a create your own story kind of adventure. And then you come in with what you come in with too. And that includes genetic traits, which are ancestral karma embodied is your genetics. So there's ways to clear that physically and more on the level of beliefs. Am I answering you?
Mm-hmm.
I need to like kind of come back.
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm just eating at the same time. But yeah, that
Yes.
makes,
So I mean, it doesn't ever make it less tragic. It's
yeah,
the most tragic. And it requires grieving. And the prayer is always like, let me learn the lessons I came here to learn with grace and with ease. And then like let me feel fully the emotions as they come so that I don't have to get another hard lesson. And if
yeah,
I do, please God, let me receive it with grace and with gratitude because that makes the difference.
yeah,
We don't ultimately have control of the exterior circumstances. We have the ability to get control over how we will respond.
yeah.
And that's why I'm
Awesome.
teaching what I'm teaching. That's the mystery of the spheroids, of the energy centers, and embodying them. And it's the mystery of the story alchemy too. But even with your example, which is so tragic of like a child getting sick, right? And
Mhm.
even in that example, to an extent, there's still a cultural element of disharmony that's attributing to that. Because from as far as I can tell, from my opinion, like childhood cancer is increasing in frequency
Yeah,
because of environmental and, additives and all kinds of disharmony of us getting further away from nature and from the flow of the animate life force, which is God. And the closer we get back to our nature and to God, which is to embody those energy centers in the spherot, and there's teachings in the mystery of how to do that, and it's pure, it's simple, it's not woo woo, it's not
yeah,
it's practical because we're in the world of action. It's just
yeah.
living, a wholesome, balanced life where you.
The thing I thought of, I don't know why I'm going into detail, but like it's not funny. Shouldn't smile. But the thing I thought of was like a kid falling out of a tree, right? Because it's like random and it's but then I think so then I'm trying to think of like what argument would I use there, but I think I could use the same argument of kids like we're not so in tune with nature and our bodies and movement, right? And so falling out of a tree is something that could easily happen, especially to a kid that's not out there climbing trees all the time.
Yeah, and like sometimes things happen and we can't explain it, and it doesn't
And
mean
they're just
it doesn't
bad.
mean life isn't happening. It doesn't
Yeah.
mean life is even against you. It's an opportunity. And I would agree with you. I've met 7-year-olds who were still babies and still kind of talk like this. And they're adorable and they're cute and they're sweet and they deserve love. And they kind of wobble on their feet and they're kind of like, I don't think they've ever been barefoot on the earth. They're just like in their shoes, kind of flopping around, and they're like kind of talking like a little baby, and they're really baby, and they still want to play with the little babies. And I've also met 7-year-olds who were
Mhm.
dressing and bathing and feeding their younger 3 siblings while also collecting wood from the forest and starting a fire and warming water up on the fire that they collected from the stream. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, I get it for sure.
And that's, it's just the point is just simply to say that there's a lot that goes into why we why it materializes the thing that we've materialized, and it takes time, but that's the 4 worlds, that's the mystery of the 4 worlds. The yud hey vav hey is how anything comes into form. So I told you the cosmology of how like creation as a whole comes into being. But the four worlds tell us the process of how any event comes into form. So God forbid, the child that fell out of the tree. I remember when I was a kid, there was a beautiful in the first, oh, you didn't ever live? You never lived in the Dunwoody house.
When I was 2, so I did briefly, but barely.
Oh, wait. No. When you were born, we were in the rental, weren't we? Or we were in the
No,
Dunwoody?
I was 2. Yeah, you're in Dunwoody.
Oh, okay. So then I remember before you were born, in the Dunwoody house, we had a beautiful tree in the front yard. What was it? It had those green, waxy magnolia tree, beautiful
Hmm.
magnolia tree. And I remember I was like climbing on it, and I loved being in the trees, of course. And I like fell a little bit, and thank God I was fine. I didn't hit my head or like really injure myself, but I did like basically puncture my thigh um with a sharp edge of a branch that was poking out, and I like got a pretty decent little puncture wound in my thigh. And thank God, like it's not like a bad wound, but it wasn't nothing. Um, so let's just use that as an example where it's not like tragic, but it's a personal example, and I can use it about myself. And it's like, well, probably I probably wasn't breathing as well as I could have been.
Hmm.
The breath is the closest thing we have to articulate God. So I was disconnected from source when I fell, probably. But why wasn't I breathing well? Probably because I'd never been taught to really breathe well. Probably because my parents weren't breathing well. They were probably in fight or flight a lot of the time. Take out probably, I know that they were. Okay, so they were in fight or flight a lot of the time. So they weren't breathing well because when you're breathing well, you're not in fight or flight. When you get in fight or flight, you start breathing faster, right? So therefore, I was in a household where I wasn't taught to breathe well. I probably wasn't breathing well a lot of the time. When I went outside to play, it's quite possible or likely that my nervous system might have been upregulated when I went out there already, and I might have been distracted and I might have been just trying to like discharge energy and playing and kind of in a world of my own, coming from this house and school where I'm inside all the time rather than being with the tree and moving with the tree. And I'm trying to kind of like be on the tree. Maybe it's a long time ago, right? And so I fell. And there's just a lot that goes in there that's deeper and deeper and deeper. And you can go back and back. And this is where we get into the generational wounds that I say unwind the generational wounds. And that's where the story work and the four worlds and the Sphero all come together to create this beautiful healing modality. I say unwind the generational wounds because why were my mom and dad not breathing well? Why were they in fight or flight? It's not like something happened that day necessarily. Or maybe it did, and it's how they chose to respond or didn't choose because they weren't accessing choice and they reacted. But why? What household did they grow up in? What household did their grandparents grow up in? And I think about our grandparents and then our great grandparents. And then I think about stories I've heard about our great grandparents that are traumatic. And I think about how they moved as infants, fleeing pogroms.
Hmm.
There's trauma there. And it comes down not in these magical, fantastical, oh, ancestral healing, but like, yeah, ancestral healing, but it's practical. It's because no one was demonstrating breathing well because no one knew how because they fled in a state of terror. And
Hmm.
breathing well is connecting to God.
Love that. Yeah, beautifully said.
That's why in meditation, you get so centered and you go, oh my God, I saw God in my meditation. Or even when you go, oh my God, you called out to God. But that's why in meditation you're breathing well.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you.
This
I'm
was
gonna
fun.
go do some shower and some work in.
Okay, get some good breaths in.
I will. I've been breathing this whole time. I love it.
Feel
Thank you.
that water on your skin.
I love you.
I love you so much. This is so good. I might post this somewhere for people.
Okay, maybe crop out the part where I'm eating, but up to
No,
you.
it's so cute. I think it's so cute. I want all of it. I
It's
feel
up
like
to you. I don't even care. All right. I love you.
good night, sweetie.
Good night.